In a world obsessed with lineage, where every significant figure is meticulously chronicled, he emerges from nowhere, speaks 3 sentences, and then vanishes without a trace. No birth is recorded, no death is mentioned, no father, no mother, no tribe, no genealogy, in a book that obsessively documents the ancestry of everyone who matters. He walks into the biblical narrative carrying bread and wine, blesses the most important man in the story, receives 1/10 of everything, and disappears without another word. His name is Melchizedek, and for more than 3,000 years he has stood as a monumental enigma. No one has been able to definitively explain his true nature or identity. Scholars have proposed a historical Canaanite king, but ancient Jewish traditions, refusing such a simple answer, elevated him into something far greater. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe him in terms normally reserved for God himself, and the New Testament argues that this man holds a priesthood greater than any in Israel's history. Each explanation only deepens the enigma, leaving every generation with the same fundamental questions. Who was Melchizedek? You might expect a mystery this old to have been solved by now, neatly filed away in history. It hasn't. Not by the rabbis of ancient Judaism, not by the early church fathers, who disagreed sharply about his nature, not by modern scholars armed with archaeology and every ancient text recovered from the sands of the Near East. The greatest minds of 30 centuries have stood before those 3 sentences and walked away without an answer. The evidence is simply too strange, so we will follow it carefully, step by step, through the ancient texts themselves, and it begins in the middle of a war. Imagine the setting, roughly 4,000 years ago. Abraham, still called Abram, has just returned from a military campaign. His nephew Lot had been captured when a coalition of 4 kings sacked the cities of the Jordan Valley. Abraham armed 318 men, pursued the armies through the night, and recovered everything. He is returning home, exhausted yet undeniably victorious. And in a quiet valley near the city of Salem, 2 kings come out to meet him. The first is the king of Sodom, who wants to negotiate over the spoils. The narrative treats him as ordinary, but the second king marks Abraham's entry into something far beyond the ordinary. Genesis 14 introduces him in a single breath. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. Read that again. A Canaanite king, ruling a city that would later become Jerusalem, is a priest of the Most High God, centuries before Israel exists, centuries before the law of Moses, centuries before the priesthood of Aaron, a man outside the covenant family entirely, who already serves the God of Abraham. And then he does something extraordinary. He blesses Abraham, and Abraham, the father of the faith, gives Melchizedek 1/10 of everything. In the ancient world, the direction of blessing and tribute mattered enormously. The lesser is blessed by the greater, which means that in this brief, astounding exchange, the text is making a claim almost too large to absorb. Melchizedek outranks Abraham. Then he vanished, unmentioned in the biblical narrative for another 1,000 years. Then, 1,000 years later, a startling echo. Psalm 110. A royal psalm attributed to David, and arguably one of the strangest passages in the Old Testament. The psalm describes a figure David calls "my Lord," seated at the right hand of God. And in verse 4, God swears an oath that has puzzled readers ever since. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. A priest forever, in the order of a man who appeared in 3 sentences 1,000 years earlier. Why would David reach back to this obscure figure? Israel already had a priesthood, an entire sacred system established at Sinai. Yet the psalm points away from all of it, toward a priesthood older than the law, held by a king with no recorded beginning and no recorded end. Something about Melchizedek would not stay buried. By the Second Temple period, Jewish tradition had begun to wrestle with him openly, and every attempt to pin him down collided with the last. Some rabbis identified him with Shem, the son of Noah, an attempt to give him a genealogy the text withholds. Others saw him as a righteous Gentile king. But among the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran in the mid-20th century, archaeologists found something that shattered every prior assumption. A fragmentary document known as 11Q Melchizedek describes him not as a man at all, but as a heavenly being, a divine figure who executes God's judgment, proclaims liberty to the captives, and presides over the final day of atonement. The scroll applies to Melchizedek passages of Scripture that speak of God himself. A community of devout Jews, 2,000 years ago, concluded that Melchizedek was something more than human. And one more detail. Salem, the city he ruled, is identified by most scholars with the settlement that became Jerusalem, the first priest of God. Most High in all of Scripture reigned on the very ground where the temple would one day stand. The geography itself seems to be pointing at something, but it is the New Testament book of Hebrews that marches directly into the heart of this mystery, daring to place Melchizedek at the core of its argument. Written to an audience steeped in the traditions of the Levitical priesthood, it poses a question no one had dared to frame so directly. If the priesthood of Aaron was sufficient, why does Psalm 110 promise a different priest from a different order entirely? For its first readers, that question was not academic, it was seismic, and to answer it, the author reads those 3 sentences in Genesis in a way that changes everything. Hebrews chapter 7 describes him this way: without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. This single verse ignites the mystery, compelling interpreters into an unending chasm of debate. One reading says the author is making a literary argument. Because Scripture records no birth and no death for Melchizedek, he functions as a picture of an eternal priesthood. The silence of the text is the point. But another reading takes the words at face value. Without beginning, without end, still a priest in the present tense, 2,000 years after Genesis. On this reading, Melchizedek was no ordinary king, but an appearance of a divine being in human history. Some early interpreters asked whether the figure who met Abraham with bread and wine was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself. Bread and wine. Brought out by an eternal priest-king of Salem, the city of peace, whose name means King of Righteousness, blessing the father of faith centuries before the law existed. The parallels are either an extraordinary coincidence, a deliberate literary design, or something the text is quietly refusing to explain. And here the true reward emerges, not a simple answer, but a revelation that reframes the entire question. The book of Hebrews, rather than resolving the mystery, deepens it, declaring that Jesus holds his priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, an order not merely older, but higher and more permanent than anything in Israel's history. Those 3 sentences in Genesis were never a footnote, they were a foundation. Step back and look at what the evidence actually gives us. Not a clear answer, but an astounding constellation of contradictions. A king with no origin in a book built on genealogies. A priest of the true God before the priesthood existed. A tribute paid by Abraham himself. A silence of 1,000 years, broken by a royal psalm. A scroll in the desert calling him heavenly, and a New Testament argument that his priesthood never ended. No other figure in Scripture carries this combination of profound presence and utter absence. He is barely there, and yet the entire structure of biblical priesthood is measured against him. Was he a historical Canaanite king whose account was preserved because of one remarkable meeting? a righteous priest chosen by God outside the covenant line, a deliberate foreshadowing of a priesthood still to come, an angelic being, or something greater still? The honest, humbling answer, after 3 millennia of debate, is that the text simply does not say. And perhaps that is no accident at all. Perhaps Melchizedek was written into Scripture precisely this way, a figure with no beginning and no end, appearing exactly long enough to bless, to receive, and to vanish, forcing every reader who meets him to confront the limits of what we can know. A question deliberately left open, standing at the door of the Bible's deepest ideas about priesthood, kingship, and the meeting point between God and humanity. 3 sentences, 3,000 years, and still one question. Who was Melchizedek? This is not just a puzzle, it is an invitation to sit with mystery, to keep asking, and to discover how much a text can say through what it refuses to tell. If you have a theory, leave it in the comments. And if you want to keep pulling at the threads the Bible leaves deliberately loose, the next mystery is waiting.